If someone had told me even a month before that my final holiday with my family would unfold in the grand dining room of our old family house outside Philadelphia, I would have dismissed the idea with a wave of my hand. That red brick colonial with its deep green shutters and wraparound porch had been the backdrop for every major event of my life. When I was young, I thought it was the most beautiful place in the world, especially in winter, when the yard was blanketed in thick, perfect snow and the old oak trees wore icicles like jewelry. My parents, Edward and Margaret, had bought the house in 1985, the year I was born, and spent almost $500,000 renovating it over the decades. It had become a kind of shrine to family history. Every photograph, every antique, and every scratch on the hardwood floors carried a story. This year, my sister Claire had insisted on hosting the holiday dinner there, and no one argued. She was always the one to take charge, for better or worse. Claire loved traditions her own, especially after moving back to Philadelphia from New York. She had thrown herself into the role of hostess with a level of energy that bordered on manic. The house gleamed when I arrived, candles glowed on the windowsills. A 7-foot tree sparkled in the foyer and every inch of the banister was wrapped in garlands. The kitchen counters groaned under the weight of dishes, honey-glazed ham, roast turkey, mashed potatoes swimming in butter, and the pie she made from scratch, just like Grandma used to. Walking through the front door, I felt a knot in my stomach, a mix of nostalgia and anxiety. My brother Adam and his wife Emily were already there, arguing quietly in the living room over which bottle of wine to bring to the table. Adam, 2 years younger than me, had always been our parents' favorite. He had the kind of easy charm that made people forgive his mistakes and a knack for making trouble seem like a joke. Emily was quieter, the sort of person who vanished into a crowd. But she had always treated me kindly, at least until recently, when the undercurrents of family drama pulled her to Adam's side. My parents moved through the house like a well-rehearsed team. My father carried trays, and my mother fussing over every little detail, from the shine on the silverware to the fold of the napkins. My mother's way of coping with stress was to focus on appearances. She changed the tablecloth 3 times before guests arrived, muttering to herself about the color scheme and whether the plates matched the chargers. My father was his usual self, moving a little slower now that he was in his 70s, but still eager to regale anyone within earshot with tales from his younger days. He had spent several years living in Europe as a young man and told the same stories every holiday. The time he lost his passport in London, the narrow escape from a pickpocket in Paris, the strange cheese he ate in Italy. These stories were part of our family mythology, as predictable as the turkey and cranberry sauce. Dinner was scheduled for 7, but by the time we sat down, it was almost 8. The delay was classic Claire, who wanted everything perfect and could never quite accept that perfection was a moving target. We gathered around the long mahogany table in the dining room, our reflections flickering in the candlelight, and for a moment, I almost believed things were normal. The clinking of glasses, the soft hum of laughter, the scent of cinnamon and roasting meat, it all felt so familiar. But underneath, I sensed a tension, a kind of brittle cheerfulness that only grows in families like mine, where old wounds are never allowed to heal and silence is mistaken for peace. Claire sat at the head of the table, wearing a crisp white blouse and an expression of barely concealed triumph. She had arranged the seating chart herself, making sure to put me directly across from her, as if she wanted to keep me within her line of sight. To her right sat our mother, thin and anxious, who had barely touched her wine. My father, graying but still imposing, sat at the other end, carving the turkey with a knife I had given him for his 60th birthday, a gift he never once thanked me for. We made small talk as we ate. Claire asked Adam about his new job at the bank, and he responded with exaggerated humility, boasting about the bonus he expected to receive at the end of the year. Emily chimed in, telling a story about their new puppy chewing through $100 pair of shoes. My parents listened, nodding politely, while I found myself tuning out, my mind drifting back to earlier years when these gatherings felt warmer, less performative. I noticed how Claire's diamond bracelet bought last spring in Chicago, she once bragged, for over $2,000 glittered every time she raised her wine glass. Eventually, my father launched into his favorite story about a Christmas he spent in Munich, where he drank glowwine at the outdoor markets. He painted such a vivid picture that for a moment, everyone seemed transported, laughing and chiming in with their own travel stories. Even Claire softened, her eyes shining with what might have been happiness. But it didn't last. The mood shifted the instant Claire cleared her throat and set her glass down, the crystal making a sharp sound against the wood. She stood up, pushing her chair back with a soft scrape, and smiled in a way that made my stomach drop. There was a strange brightness in her eyes, as if she had been rehearsing this moment all day. I should have known then that something was coming, but I tried to believe, if only for a second, that maybe she was going to make some happy announcement. Before we eat dessert, I have something important to say, she began. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she folded them in front of her. She looked around the table, pausing just long enough to make us all uncomfortable before settling her gaze on me. This isn't easy, but it's necessary. For years, I've tried to keep this family together. I've tried to overlook the fights and the misunderstandings. But I can't pretend anymore. Rachel, you are no longer part of this family. We've all agreed. Her words hung in the air, suspended like icicles, sharp and cold. I looked around the table, expecting anyone to protest. But there was only silence. My mother stared at her lap, her hands twisting a napkin into a knot. My father's face was impassive, his jaw clenched. Adam and Emily exchanged a glance, then, as if on cue, started clapping. The sound was hollow, echoing strangely in the candlelit room. I felt the ground shift beneath me. It wasn't just the announcement. It was the realization that they had all talked about this, probably for months. And I had been the only one left in the dark. I wondered how many phone calls, how many whispered conversations had taken place behind my back. I thought of all the times I had lent money thousands of dollars over the years. Always without interest, always with the hope that it would help keep us together. I thought of Claire's law school tuition, which I'd paid for in installments. $25,000 at a time because she couldn't get enough financial aid. I thought of Adam's mortgage, the vacations I'd subsidized, the medical bills I'd helped cover when my mother was in and out of hospitals for her heart. I looked at each of them in turn, searching for any sign of regret. My mother dabbed at her eyes but made no move to speak. My father kept his gaze fixed on the centerpiece, a bowl of pinnacones and holly, ranged with military precision. Adam grinned, his arms folded, looking oddly pleased with himself. Emily's face was carefully neutral, but she didn't meet my eyes. The crackling of the fireplace was the only sound. I could smell the wax from the candles, the lingering spices from the kitchen. I realized in that moment that everything had changed. The people at the table were no longer my family. They were strangers sitting in a house full of memories, acting out a scene I hadn't been given the script for. I took a deep breath, willing myself to stay calm. I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me cry. Instead, I sat up straighter, folded my hands in my lap, and waited to see what would happen next. In the moments after Claire's announcement, the world seemed to shrink to the silent, candlelit oval of the dining room table. It was as if everyone had run out of words, their mouths frozen open with shock or satisfaction or, in my mother's case, muted grief. I could feel their eyes on me, each gaze heavy with expectation, curiosity, or resentment. But what I remember most was the cold, unshakable calm that settled over me. It was almost clinical, like standing outside myself and watching a performance I'd rehearsed 1,000 times in my mind. The years of walking on eggshells, of biting my tongue, of telling myself I was overreacting, had all led me to this moment. I was not going to let myself tremble, not in front of them. Without a word, I reached down to the soft brown leather bag resting by my chair. My hand found the blue folder, instantly hard, plastic, battered at the corners, stuffed so full it barely closed. I set it on the table in front of me with deliberate care. The thud oddly loud in the hush of the room. I looked at each of them in turn, meeting their eyes. My father's face was stone. Adam's was twisted in a smirk that wavered when I held his gaze for a heartbeat too long. Emily's lips formed a tight, uncertain line. Claire looked triumphant until she saw the folder. I thought this might happen, I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried. So I brought some things to share. If we're putting everything on the table tonight, I'd like to contribute too. For years, I had lived with the sense that my value to this family was measured in silent sacrifices. The check quietly deposited in Adam's account when he called at midnight. Frantic about another temporary setback, the tuition payments to Claire's law school that always came with a promise to pay me back as soon as she made partner, the home equity line one, helped secure when my parents couldn't cover the new roof after the hurricane. The night I wired $20,000 from my savings. There were the smaller things too. Things no one ever mentioned: allowed a plane ticket for Emily to fly home for Christmas. The time I paid the vet bill for Claire's dog when she was traveling in Europe. The weekend I spent babysitting Adam's kids when he and Emily needed a real break. None of it was ever repaid, but it was never forgotten either. Not by me. I opened the folder and began laying out the contents with slow, precise motions. First, the printouts of the bank transfers, Claire's tuition line by line, $50,000 across for years. Each transfer was highlighted in neon pink, the notations in the memo line, for Claire. Spring tuition, Claire's rent, NY, book deposit, painfully specific. Next, Adam's emails, neatly printed and organized by year, most with some variation of "please don't tell mom and dad, I'll pay you back next month." I placed them in a small pile and pushed them toward him. The color drained from his face as he glanced at the subject lines, each one a marker of a crisis. real or exaggerated, that I had been expected to solve. My parents watched in confusion as I set down the letter from my father, dated 3 years prior. Written in his slanting, impatient script, "Rachel, if you could cover the contractor for the roof, I swear we'll pay you back in full. It's only temporary, we just don't have the cash flow after Margaret's surgery." I remembered standing at the bank counter that afternoon, feeling both pride and dread as I wired $20,000, telling myself that this time, it was a family emergency. The final stack was thickest: credit card statements, emails confirming vacation rentals, invoices for everything from Christmas presents to plane tickets. I had highlighted the charges that belonged to me, and the ones I had covered for everyone else: dinners out in Chicago, Broadway tickets in New York, a weekend ski trip in Vermont. Each page was annotated with a sticky note: covered for family, never reimbursed. I watched my mother's face as she realized how much of those memories, those family times, had quietly depended on my willingness to foot the bill. By now, the room had changed. The smugness had faded from Adam's posture, and Claire's mouth had gone slack, her eyes fixed on the growing pile of documents. My father cleared his throat, but the sound seemed thin. Only Emily spoke, her voice barely above a whisper: "Rachel, what is all this?" I looked at her. "It's the truth, Emily. Every time there was a problem, I was the solution. Every time someone fell short, I was expected to make it right. Not because I had more, but because I never said no. I thought that was what families did for each other. But apparently, there's a line I didn't know I could cross. I guess I finally found it." My mother finally lifted her head. Her eyes were rimmed red, but there was something steely in her voice. "Rachel, why are you doing this? Why tonight, of all nights?" I paused, letting the silence stretch. "Because I'm tired, Mom. I'm tired of being the only one who remembers what was given and what was taken. I'm tired of pretending I haven't been keeping track when all I've done for years is keep track, just to survive. Tonight, Claire made it clear that I'm not welcome as a sister or a daughter. So I wanted to be just as clear what I've been to this family: a safety net, a wallet, a fixer. Not a person, not a sister, not a daughter, just convenient." No one spoke for a long time. The only sounds were the ticking of the old clock on the mantel and the faint pop of a log in the fireplace. For once, Claire had nothing to say. Her face had gone pale, her eyes darting from the folder to the table as if hoping to find an escape route. Adam sat back, arms crossed, lips pressed tight, unwilling to meet my gaze. My father opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it, looking suddenly very old, the lines in his face deepening as he stared down at the letter he had written me in a moment of need and then clearly chosen to forget. "I never asked for applause," I said, finally breaking the silence. "I never wanted gratitude. I just wanted to be treated like I mattered, like I belonged. Instead, I've been treated like an ATM that never runs out. Tonight, when you all decided that you'd rather celebrate me leaving than ask me why I'm hurting, you made it clear that I don't belong. So I'm making a choice too." I gathered the papers, leaving them in neat piles for each person. I slid the tuition stack toward Claire, the emails toward Adam, the contractor letter toward my father, and the receipts and statements toward my mother. I kept my voice even, my hands steady. "I brought copies for each of you, so no one can say they didn't know or that it was all in my head. I'm done carrying this by myself. If you want to keep pretending, that's your choice. But I won't be part of it anymore." For a moment, it looked as if Claire might speak, but she said nothing. Adam shifted in his seat, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrests. My mother dabbed at her eyes again, her composure slipping as she looked at the evidence of how many times she had turned a blind eye to my sacrifices. My father just stared, the words he might have said swallowed by pride or regret, I'll never know which. As I looked around the table, the strangest feeling swept over me: relief. Not anger, not sadness, but the weightless release that comes from telling the truth at last, even if no one wants to hear it. The truth was ugly, and so was their reaction, but for the first time, I felt I could breathe. "I think that's all I have to say," I said, standing and smoothing the front of my dress. "I hope, someday, you'll understand why I had to do this. But even if you don't, that's all right. I'm finally doing what's right for me." No one stopped me as I gathered my bag and walked from the room, leaving the folder and the weight of the past on the table behind me. The cold air in the hallway stung my cheeks, but I didn't look back. I was done begging for a place in a family that had made it clear I was only ever valued for what I could give, not for who I was. And in the stillness that followed, I discovered something I'd been missing for years: peace, edged with the sharp clarity of truth. For a long moment after my words faded, no one moved. I felt the heat of their disbelief, their outrage, pressing in on me as I gathered my folder and reached into my coat pocket. The house key, the one with the little blue fob I'd carried since I was 16, felt oddly heavy. I placed it gently on the gleaming mahogany table, letting the silence settle over the room. I didn't bother with another speech. I'd said what needed to be said. As I rose, I caught Claire's eye. For the first time that evening, she looked unsure. My mother made a tiny, pleading gesture with her hand, but her voice caught in her throat. My father stared at the key as if it were a snake. "I'm done," I said quietly, my voice steadier than I expected. "Legally and emotionally, I want no ties to any of you. My lawyer will send papers in the new year." The sentence felt final, almost ceremonial, a closing of a chapter that had dragged on too long. I picked up my coat and bag and walked down the hall, my footsteps echoing on the polished wood floors, past the old photos lining the wall, childhood birthdays, graduation, summer barbecues, my father in his army uniform, my mother at her wedding. It struck me how easily a life could be reduced to photographs and how much those images lied. They captured smiles and togetherness, but none of the tension that had thickened over the years like smoke in closed rooms. Outside, the Philadelphia air was sharp and clear, biting through my wool coat and making me gasp. Snow crunched beneath my boots. The street was quiet, empty except for the glow of Christmas lights in the windows of neighboring houses. For a moment, I stood there on the porch, the cold stinging my cheeks, trying to decide if I was brave or foolish. Then I started walking. I did not look back. It was nearly midnight by the time I reached the center of the city. The folder still clutched in my gloved hand, Chestnut Street was mostly deserted. The last of the shoppers and revelers gone home, leaving behind only the glow of the street lamps and the drifting flakes that melted on my hair and shoulders. I found a small hotel, the kind of place that caters to business travelers and conference guests. Nothing special, but clean and quiet. At the front desk, I paid for 2 nights with my card, $270. Gone in seconds, but it felt like a bargain for peace and privacy. The room was simple, a king-sized bed with crisp sheets, a desk, and a window overlooking the silent street below. I shut the door and locked it, leaning against the solid wood. In that instant, the exhaustion hit me, a wave of fatigue so deep it seemed to sink into my bones. I took off my coat, dropped the folder on the desk, and collapsed onto the bed. Burying my face in the pillow, the tears came, finally, slow and quiet, not out of regret, but out of relief. For the first time in years, I didn't have to brace myself for the next demand, the next accusation, the next subtle dig cloaked in concern. I let myself rest, wrapped in the soft hotel blanket, listening to the hum of the heater and the occasional honk of a distant car. The world outside could wait. In that little room, I was alone, untethered, unburdened. I slept the way I hadn't slept in years, deeply and without fear. When I woke in the pale light of morning, the old patterns kicked in. I reached for my phone to check for messages from family, then stopped myself. There would be messages, I knew, but I wasn't ready. Instead, I made coffee in the tiny machine by the window and sat watching the city wake up. The sidewalk slowly filling with people, the sky a hazy gray. I felt strange and tethered, weightless, as if my life had shifted on its axis. But underneath that, a new kind of calm was taking root. The dread I'd carried for so long was gone. In its place was a quiet certainty that I had done what I needed to do. The calls and texts started that afternoon, just as I'd expected. The phone buzzed on the desk, message after message. My mother first, her words frantic and tearful, begging me to come home, to not ruin the holiday. She pleaded with me to remember that family is everything, that we all make mistakes, that Claire didn't mean it the way it sounded. The guilt spilled out in paragraphs, each message more desperate than the last. Then Adam called. I let it go to voicemail, but I didn't have to listen to know what he would say. Adam had always been the golden child, but now his voice was sharp, accusing me of overreacting, of trying to destroy the family's reputation, of making a scene. "You're blowing this way out of proportion," his message said. "Just because you have money doesn't mean you can hold it over everyone's head. We're supposed to forgive each other. That's what families do." I stared at the phone, wondering if he'd ever forgive himself for the way he'd leaned on me, or if he'd ever recognized the truth at all. Claire's messages came next, texts, then emails, each one shifting in tone as she realized I was not going to reply. At first, she sounded outraged, calling me selfish, accusing me of betraying our parents. "You're tearing this family apart for no reason," she wrote, "after everything I've done for you. You repay me by humiliating us in front of everyone? Grow up, Rachel." But as the hours passed and I remained silent, her anger faded into something more manipulative. "I know you're hurting," she texted. "I'm willing to talk if you'll just admit you overreacted. We can fix this if you apologize." Even Emily, who rarely involved herself in conflict, sent a long email. She wrote about forgiveness, about family, about how everyone was under stress. And people say things they don't mean. She told me that Adam wasn't himself, that Claire had too much to drink, that my parents were just scared of losing their children. Her words were kind but hollow. I read them once, then deleted the message. I did not respond. Not that day, or the next, or the one after. Instead, I went for long walks around the city, wandering from Rittenhouse Square to the river. past Independence Hall through the quiet, wintry streets. I let myself remember the good times ice skating as kids, 4th of July picnics in the backyard, my mother's laugh when she was young and happy. But I also let myself remember the bad, the silences, the secrets, the casual betrayals. It was all part of my story now, and I would not edit any of it away. On the second day, I used my laptop to look up a local attorney specializing in family and estate law. I made an appointment for the following week, then sent a single email, short, formal, direct, explaining that I wished to cut all financial and legal ties with my family. The lawyer replied within the hour, reassuring and efficient, outlining the next steps. It felt like drawing a final, heavy curtain. There was sadness, but also a growing sense of power, of agency. For so long, I'd played by someone else's rules. Now, I was writing my own. I changed my phone number, updated my email address, and set my social media accounts to private. I did not post any explanations or dramatic declarations. I simply disappeared, step by step, from the channels my family had used to reach me. Each small action was a brick in the wall I was building, protective, necessary, overdue. By the end of the week, the legal paperwork was ready. Sitting at a cafe with a coffee and a scone, I read through the documents carefully, then signed them all. My hands shook only a little. The final act was both mundane and profound, one signature and I was free. My lawyer sent the papers by courier to my parents' house, ensuring there could be no confusion. No last-minute pleas or denials. I watched the delivery status update online. A strange satisfaction blooming in my chest as I saw the confirmation: delivered, received, irrevocable. That evening, alone in my hotel room, I let myself grieve, not for the family I had lost, but for the years I had spent believing that love had to be earned, that boundaries were betrayals, that my needs mattered less than everyone else's. I realized that walking away was not an act of anger but of self-respect. It was a quiet declaration: I am allowed to leave what harms me, even if it wears the name of family. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I looked out at the city lights and felt at peace, ready to begin again. Moving to Boston felt both impulsive and inevitable, as if every decision leading up to that point, every dollar spent, every argument survived, every boundary crossed had prepared me for this leap. I'd always loved the city from a distance, its blend of old brick and glass, its riverside walks, its reputation for both intellect and reinvention. Boston was a place where history and possibility coexisted, where no one cared who your family was or what drama you'd left behind in Philadelphia. I packed my few essentials into the trunk of my gray sedan and drove north on a cold January morning, watching the skyline of my old life shrink in the rearview mirror. I found my apartment in Cambridge after 2 days of searching, a tiny but sunlit loft on the 3rd floor of a converted warehouse, overlooking the gray ribbon of the Charles River. The rent was high by my old standards, $2,200 a month, but for the first time, I didn't have to consult anyone or justify the expense. The walls were painted dull beige, the floors scuffed with years of stories. But I saw the potential instantly. I signed the lease with my hand, wrote the check for the deposit from my savings, and felt an unfamiliar thrill at the realization that I answered to no one. Moving in was a solitary process. I made 3 trips up the narrow staircase, carrying boxes of clothes, a battered armchair I'd rescued from a thrift shop, and the blue folder now closed for good containing the paperwork from my old life. I bought a mattress online and set it up myself, managing to wrestle the thing into place with a kind of stubborn pride. I wandered through the empty rooms, planning how I'd make the space my own. I painted the living area a shade called lemon souffle, so bright and absurd that I couldn't help but smile every time I looked at it. I bought cheap curtains in a cheery floral pattern, hung a few prints I'd collected over the years, and started to feel at home. The freedom was intoxicating, but so was the quiet. I spent the first week wandering the neighborhood, learning the rhythms of the city. I walked along the esplanade, shivering in the winter wind, my cheeks flushed from the cold. I stopped in coffee shops where no one knew my name and lost hours browsing the shelves of tiny independent bookstores. The anonymity was both a comfort and a challenge. For the first time in my adult life, no one expected anything from me, not money, not advice, not sacrifice. The only person whose approval I needed was my own. And that was a revelation as much as it was a responsibility. I used my savings cautiously, drawing from the nest egg I'd built over the years of living frugally. I set a budget and tracked every dollar spent, determined to prove to myself that I could build something stable and lasting. I found a job at a nonprofit downtown, managing grants and donor relations, a far cry from the high-pressure world of finance that had shaped so much of my adult life, but one that let me leave work at the office and sleep soundly at night. The pay was modest, $68,000 a year, but it was enough, and every paycheck felt like a small, personal victory. To fill the long evenings, I started volunteering at the local animal shelter, The work was messy, sometimes exhausting, but I found a sense of calm in the company of animals who demanded nothing but kindness and patience. There was a golden retriever named Max who followed me everywhere, and a black and white cat, Oscar, who curled up on my lap during breaks as if he'd known me forever. I looked forward to my shifts, grateful for a place where my presence mattered but wasn't taken for granted. I took up painting again, a hobby I'd abandoned in college when life grew too hectic and serious. I set up a little studio in the corner of my living room, spreading drop cloths over the floor and covering the walls with canvases, in various stages of completion. My first paintings were clumsy crooked bridges, muddy skies, awkward still lifes, but I kept at it, losing myself in the movement of brush against canvas, the way colors blended and blurred. It didn't matter if anyone else ever saw them, the act of creating something, anything, was enough. There were moments of loneliness, too, when the silence of my new life pressed in and the old ache of belonging returned. Sometimes in the evenings, I'd catch myself reaching for my phone, half expecting a message from my mother or Claire or even Adam, only to remember that I'd cut those lines for a reason. The guilt would creep in at odd hours, especially on holidays or when I saw families laughing together in restaurants. I'd wonder if I had made things worse, if I was missing out on some essential, unfixable part of life. The world was quick to judge people who walked away from their families, especially women. And there were days when the weight of that judgment felt like a stone in my chest. But those moments grew rarer as time passed. Each day, I made a new choice to prioritize my well-being, to build a life around what I valued, not what was demanded of me. I made friends slowly, colleagues from work, a neighbor named Linda who knocked on my door one night to borrow a hammer, and ended up staying for tea. The other volunteers at the shelter who welcomed me with easy camaraderie. I learned to cook for one, discovered the quiet joy of reading in bed until midnight, and marveled at how much easier it was to sleep without the burden of resentment or obligation. As winter gave way to spring, I found myself letting go of old habits. I stopped checking my family's social media for news, stopped rehearsing what I'd say if someone reached out. The legal ties had been severed, but now the emotional ones were fraying too, replaced by something softer and understanding that I didn't owe anyone an explanation for choosing peace over chaos. When people at work asked about my family, I answered honestly but simply. We're not close, I'd say, and leave it at that. Sometimes, if someone seemed genuinely curious or kind, I'd share a little more and the world didn't end. No one recoiled. Most people understood more than I expected. My greatest realization came quietly on a Sunday morning as I sat at my little kitchen table with a mug of coffee and a view of the river. The light spilled across the lemon walls and I felt, for once, completely at ease. I understood, finally, that self-worth isn't something anyone can give or take away. It's built quietly, stubbornly choosing yourself, by drawing lines where others trample, by refusing to trade your peace for someone else's comfort. I thought back to the years when I measured my value by how much I gave, how much I sacrificed, how little I asked for in return. I realized now that love given out of fear or guilt is never really love at all. True connection, I was learning, only flourished where there was room for honesty and respect. On the anniversary of my last holiday dinner in Philadelphia, I treated myself to a day out in Boston. I wandered through the Museum of Fine Arts, lingering in front of a painting that glowed with the same colors I'd chosen for my walls. I bought myself lunch at a tiny bistro, savoring the solitude, the sense of a life fully owned. That night, I walked home along the river, watching the city lights shimmer on the water, and felt a gratitude so deep it brought tears to my eyes. If people ask about my family now, I tell the truth. I gave what I could, I endured what I could, and when it wasn't enough, I walked away. Every day since, I have built something new, sometimes awkward, sometimes lonely, but always real. I am not perfect. I am not unscarred. But I am free. And every day, in this little loft by the river, I am grateful that I chose myself at last.